Okay, so no dirty talk anymore. Okay, so for the recording again, today we want to talk about to fly fast and what you have to do, what decisions are there you have to make to make this happen. There we are. Sorry, I'm still getting organized here. The Zoom controls are overlapping my my others. It's always funny. Okay, everybody see a laser now? Yep, I guess. Okay. So why do we need to go fast? Anything, if you want to fly any distance greater than 400 kilometers, if you're not fast enough, the day will not be long enough. So you can fly, let's say, a 300K task still at the speed of 50 kilometers an hour. Takes you 6 hours. And as in a good day, there is 6 hours you can do that. But if you want to fly any faster, when you, for example, are going for your diamonds, 500, it's not just a matter of flying further, it's also a matter of flying faster, so you can do it, you can complete the task in the hours the day gives you, right? On a good day, you have maybe from 11 o'clock to, at least in Ontario, let's say from 11 o'clock to 7 o'clock, so about 8 hours, right? And so that's, you know, with a 500, that would really be stretching it. Okay, so then of course, if you fly every gliding contest, people are always asking me, well, a gliding contest, what is this? Is it about how long you stay up, or what is it, right? It's a race. It's like everything else in life. It's a race. The fastest wins. And so therefore you need to be fast. And then basically speed is the measure how efficiently we are utilizing the energy that is there. The more efficient we are, the faster we will be, and the higher our speed will be. What's your measuring stick? Now, from out of the McCready, this is an old diagram from Reichmann's Streckensegelflug. This is a book that's also available in an English translation, but nowadays, I mean, Helmut Reichmann sadly died in a gliding accident. He actually collided with a student many years ago, so it's a bit dated. So nowadays, it's better if you want to read something, go for the Bernard Ecke books. That's a really good book. It's called Advanced Soaring Made Easy. And I think Dave sells them. So yes, that's good stuff. So for any given day, if you want to figure out how fast you will be, take your this is the polar diagram of your airplane, and say, well, assuming in this case here, in this example, my average lift will be 2 knots, 1 meters per second is 2 knots. And then you take from up, you put this up here on your lift and sink axis. This is here is your speed axis. You put it up, and then you draw a tangent from there down to your polar, and that gives you the speed you should be flying if you set your McCready ring to 2 knots. And where this line crosses the 0 line, your speed axis, that is sort of as per McCready theory, and there's many problems with this we'll discuss later, but it gives you sort of some idea of how fast, what your speed should be, depending on the lift available for any given day. If you have a gliding computer, you can just dial in McCready 2 or so, and it will actually give you the speed you should be flying at that setting if the air mass is inert. So if the air mass neither goes up or down, then it gives you that as the speed. Of course, in reality, air masses go up and down, but that would be actually this point and this speed. Okay, belabored this long enough. So on this, for this airplane, on this day with the 2-knot average out there, you should be flying 60 kilometers an hour. Not very, this is in kilometers an hour here. Not very exciting. But it would be a really weak day, and we wouldn't really go cross country on a day where we only expect the 2-knot lift. It's just not enough. It's too slow, and the risk of landing out a weak lift usually is also goes hand in hand with a low thermal max height. The thermals will top out fairly low, and so there's big holes in there, and the chances of landing out are pretty big. So you don't want to go. Okay, so what is affecting really your speed? It is what rate of climb you realize, and for low time pilots, that is the area where you really have to work on, where you have to get better. I see it again and again when we fly at our cross country clinics in 2-seaters with low time pilots. Yes, they're in the thermal, but they are not in the core, and they are not climbing. They're just not climbing fast enough. They're happy that it's not going down, but if you want to, you have to maximize your climb rate. So you have to basically find the core and then stay in the core in the thermal. And if you remember from a thermaling talk last year, the best bank angle for a wide range of airplanes, so modern type sailplanes, once you're in the core is about 45 degrees. But you also have to fly slow enough, right? So that's typically, depending on the wing loading, anywhere from 45 to 55 knots. So if you have no water, then it's more like 45 knots or between 45 and 50. So don't go too fast, because if you go faster or too fast, your radius in the turn will increase with the speed, with the square of the speed. So you got to keep your speed under control. I see this quite often. That be thermal in a 2-seater, and the nose is just way too low, right? We are running around in circles and 65 knots. It's just too fast. You'll never get into that way. You'll never get into the core. You may hit it every once in a while, but you can't stay in there. Okay, so the other thing is, well, so once you have sort of learned climbing well in thermals, you can practice this every time you fly, of course, and just sort of measure yourself against other airplanes, right? And then the next thing is you have to, how do you plan your route? Of course, you have to plan, the task is planned out, but it's very unlikely that you will just fly on the track you put on paper. You will have to make deviations to find better lift and go around areas that where it's not working and so. And planning your route is the next fairly big thing, right? And then after that, we're coming to how fast are we flying from thermal to thermal? And this is where McCready comes in. And there's lots of talk about McCready speeds and so, and how to set it and so on. And we'll talk about this a little later, and what limitations the McCready model has. One limitation, for example, it does not recognize a ground. So in other words, landing out is not a factor for McCready, so it's not built into this model, right? Okay, then sometimes the conditions change, right? It could be it's a boomer day, and all of a sudden, boom, you get into a different air mass if you fly big tasks, and then you have to shift gears, or a different air mass comes in, or cirrus moves over, or whatever, right? And if you keep on going in boomer mode, then you'll be on the ground probably pretty quickly. And the other way around, if the day starts really weak, and you fly very conservatively, and then day gets really strong, then you also have to shift gears up and start flying, basically set your McCready higher, fly at higher speeds, and take more risks. And when I say risks in this context, I don't mean the risk that you crash. The risk here is that you may fall out of your working band or get stuck, or in the worst case, land out, right? That's when I talk about risk is what I mean. Then, of course, if you have an airplane with water, ballast is a major factor. Ballast, it's basically how much water you put in. And that's also a decision you make in the morning, but you can vary it during the day. Like you can drop your ballast instead. You don't have to drop it all. You can drop it in buckets of 20 liters or so, if you know how long it takes, what flow rate you have out of your airplane. So you have, at some point you have to time that. We'll be talking more about that. And then the final glide is in competitions is quite often is very important in what speed in the end you get, because the final glide is the fastest part of your flight usually. In a well-planned final glide where you sort of slide in organically from your en route flying is really good. Okay, so we got 57 on the call now, so no need yet to stress the the bigger license. Okay, so let's talk about routes. First of all, if you can avoid stopping for thermals, low-time pilots have a tendency to fly from thermal to thermal to thermal. Like whenever it goes up, they try to thermal. If you can fly straight and fly in rising air, or in air that's in rising air basically, and we call it good air, by following terrain features, high ground ridges, and of course cloud streets. And I mean, here in southwestern Ontario, convergence lines, we got convergence lines along Lake Erie when the winds from the northwest, and we also got convergence lines along the shores of Lake Huron in easterly conditions. Easterly conditions, of course, make it very difficult to get away from SOSA, but if you do, running up and down the shore there of Lake Huron, this is pretty exciting. Okay, got to make it home though, of course, afterwards. Okay, and so if you're flying along and now you have to stop because you need to climb, and you have choices ahead of you. One is a little upwind, of course. The other one is downwind, of course. Always take the upwind thermal because it starts as you're climbing, drifting you back on your course line. And then, of course, try to find the strongest lift. Don't climb in weak lift. Okay, so in other words, if you can fly straight, circling is for the birds. You're not moving. If your nose doesn't point where you want to go, then you're not going there. You're basically stopping, and that's okay. If you stop in a strong thermal, that's fine. You need that too. Then pretty soon you'll be with good speed on your way again. But if you stop in weak thermals, you can lose a lot of time there. And we also got to realize the race is as much in the climb as in the run. I mean, in the run, everybody thinks we're going fast. This is the race. But if you're climbing at 2 knot average and somebody else is climbing at 4, he's twice as fast as you are. Keep that in mind. Okay, so let's look at the practical example here. This be your course line, and this sort of be a cloud seen from above, let's say, or from below. And of course, you want to check this cloud if there is thermals. So what do you do? Ideally, where is typically under clouds, where are the hot spots where you would look for thermals. That's one of them is, of course, in the center. And if you fly through in the center, you would hit that one. Then some clouds work upwind. Some clouds work on the sunny side. Ideal is if the wind and the sunny side coincide, then there is a pretty good chance there's a thermal. But as you fly under this cloud, how do you make sure you hit all the possibilities quickly without running around under this cloud and looking for the thermal? Of course, our hotspots are either the sunny side, the center, or the wind, as I said. And if you sort of you just deviate your course slightly to hit the sunny side first, then the side that's closest to your course line. Then you transition over through the middle, maybe the thermal is there, then you hit this side. And then if it's not working, you keep on going, right? And if you look at this deviation, it's not, you haven't really lost much, right? I mean, it's a little longer than the direct route, but you have a much better chance to hit the core, right? On the direct route, you only have this chance, right? Or if you go there and you start dithering, there is nothing, and then you go here and it's not here, and you go back here, then you have lost a lot of time. So if you can just do this in one swoop to find the lift under the cloud, you should also look up at the bottom of the cloud. Quite often there is sort of a swirl that hangs down sort of in the center of the cloud, where the air that's going up, and it's going up so fast that it starts condensating a little earlier, right? And quite often these swirls are indicating a center. Okay. And deviations when we are sort of en route. Again, this is our course line, and the wind be from the left here. Let's put on some thermals, and things are pretty obvious when you talked about this earlier. Here, you don't want to fly in the blue hole. You want to take advantage of the lift around it. But ideally, of course, you fly on the upwind side, because again, if you stop here, you'll be drifting back on your course line. Or if you stop here, and the clouds will actually, while you're going there, they will also move closer to your course line. If you start chasing clouds downwind, you'll first of all find it's a long way, it's a lot further off than you thought, because the cloud keeps moving away from you. And then if you need to go to the thermal under one of those, then by the time you're done, you're out here, right? And then you have to get back to onto your course line. So that's why upwind deviations are always better. But of course, if you have downwind, the cloud's really close, or lift really close, and upwind, there's a huge blue hole, right? At some point, it makes more sense to go downwind. So when I give you these rules, none of these rules is a rule that applies for every case. Every case is different. That's the beauty at soaring, and also the exciting part. It is if you have to always look at the general situation and make your decision based on that. But it's good to know, to have sort of some basics to follow. Okay, so now look a little more on deviations. There's a good paper out from John Cochran and about deviations and how far we should deviate. And one of the things that is coming out is that the angle of the deviation, that's really what matters. What doesn't matter is if you deviate far, or so basically if you have one big deviation or many little ones. The distance, the additional distance between those two, this one and this one, is exactly the same. It's really the angle that matters. And if this angle is the same as this one, the amount of distance you have to cover additionally to cover this deviation is the same. So now let's look at the angles. So this is the deviation angle here, and this is the efficiency. Efficiency meaning if you're flying exactly the distance that is on your course line, then it's 100%. So you're 100% efficient. And obviously, if you have zero deviation, that's what you are. You fly 10 kilometers, and you progress 10 kilometers on your course line, assuming there's no wind, right? And so now you want to deviate 10 degrees. You look over, you're still very efficient. You're losing basically 1.5%. That's easy. 20 degrees, you're losing 6%. Not bad either. 30 degrees, and 30 degrees is a significant deviation, right? You're losing, but the loss is not so great either. You're losing 13.4%, which is still an acceptable loss. If there's you're deviating for nice cloud, I mean, obviously you need to have a reason for the deviation. So the reason is being you're trying to find some lift. But as soon as you go more than 30, and that's the important thing here is, then it really grows. If you do a 45 degree deviation, you already lose 30%, and 60 degrees you lose half. So you're only half efficient. So in otherwise, with a 60-degree deviation, you're basically flying double the distance than you double than your direct distance, and that's not good. So basically, what we take away from this is that up to 30 degrees, that's pretty good for deviations, but avoid others. I mean, there are, again, examples where you're somewhere and there's no thermal for you. You need a thermal. There's no thermal on the way for you anymore. There's a nice cloud, maybe 3 kilometers, right, 90 degrees to course line. Sometimes it pays to go there, even though it's from a deviation point of view a big penalty. It happens. I mean, this is then another decision you have to make. But if you can find other things around, or you have you can deviate to clouds that are not so far off your course line, take those. Try to avoid more than 30 degrees. Okay. The other thing is you have to plan early. Let's say this is a 60-kilometer lake, and somehow in the middle of the lake there is something that prevents you from flying through it. This could be a rain shower. This could be there's a lake underneath and everything's blue around here, or whatever, right? Or there's a thunder shower sitting there, or whatever, right? If you should plan, you can see this, right? And if you start planning early, like in this part, you make a deviation and you deviate from your course line about 20 degrees. Since this angle, remember the angle counts, not how far. Since this angle is only 18.4 degrees, you come around here, you avoid this area, you come back. And instead of 60 kilometers, you flew 63.2 kilometers, which makes you still 95% efficient. If you procrastinate, if you let it be and you fly right up to the problem and say, oh, can't go through here. Now you turn 90 degrees to one side, to the right in this case, and fly out your 20 kilometers, and then you come back on the course line. Then you have flown 81 or almost 82 kilometers on a 60-kilometer leg, and you're only 73% efficient, so you lost something like 27% on that leg. So the idea here is, if you have to deviate, make your decision early. That helps you to avoid bad angles as well, right? And again, so plan ahead, then avoid the deviations of more than 30 degrees. And again, take the wind into account whenever possible, or whenever reasonable, deviate into the wind. Okay. It also, deviations, if they pay or not, also very much depend on how strong the day is. And so assuming you're working at 2-knot thermal, right? And but you expect with a deviation you can get 3-knot. So let's work this out. So here's the green line is a 2-knot thermal line. And so this is the lift here and the thermal you have, and this is the deviation in degrees. So you have a 2-knot thermal, but you say, well, there's another cloud that looks a lot better, so maybe it can have 3 knots there. You can actually justify a deviation all the way up to that's about 30. It's more than 30 degrees, right? So that's about 30, yes, 34, 33 degrees. However, a 2-knot is a pretty weak thermal, right? If this becomes, so if in weak thermals, you can deviate along, this is the 1-knot thermal line here, it makes sense to deviate a long ways. But nevertheless, at some point you hit this, what we call the wall, where all of a sudden it becomes very inefficient at a certain angle, right? And if you have, the other thing is, if you fly in strong thermals, let's say, so this is 5 knots. You have a 5-knot thermal, and you see a cloud, and you assume you get a 10-knot thermal there, right? So you can double your climb rate. The biggest deviation you can actually justify is just 30 degrees, even for a double climb rate. Whereby, for example, if you are the 1-knot thermal, you want to double your climb rate to 2 knots, you can justify a 60-degree deviation. So the takeaway on this is the stronger the thermals for the day, or if you fly in very strong areas, the more direct you want to fly. If it's pretty weak, so if you're getting 2-knot averages and so, then you can justify much bigger deviations. And that has an influence on how people are flying. Typically, Eastern pilots who fly in, so this is the eastern part of the continent, where, well, the gliding conditions are not so great. They typically deviate a lot for lift. Western pilots, they are used to locking into this 8 to 10 knot thermal, climbing up, and then they go straight to the next one. They tend to deviate very little. So there's a different flying style that is born out of what conditions typically people fly in. So the Western pilots, they fly up here, right? The Eastern pilots fly down here. And the Eastern pilots deviate more because it pays more. So when Westerners come to the East, I've heard this before, they say, well, you can't fly here, right? This is impossible. The thermals are so weak, and I can't find any, right? Because they're not deviating. They're going always straight, right? That's what they're used from the West. So they're not getting, they don't realize that they can actually justify a 35-degree or 34-degree deviation just to get 1 extra knot from 2 to 3 knots. Okay. Do we have any questions to this at this point? Okay, hearing none. I should also say, I forgot to say this initially. Thanks for all muting your microphones. That's good, and keeps all the background noise away. But if you have any questions, feel free to unmute and just blurt it out. That's fine, or you can put it in the chat. And my assistants, Oliver and Emerson, thank you very much, guys. I'm monitoring the chat, and they will alert me if there's if I need to stop and explain something. Okay.
Hello, Jörg.
Yes.
It's Ian.
Yes.
Is this figure you're showing universal? I think it is.
Yes.
For every glider.
Yeah, it's pretty much for every glider. I mean, there's high performance gliders are a little different than lower performance gliders, but the trend is in general, this is the trend. It means for weak thermals, you can deviate further. For strong thermals, don't bother. The curves may look a little different for a higher performance glider, but not much.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Ian, while you're on the call here,
yes.
The next Hangar Talk next Sunday, we have a panel discussions between instructors and students for cross-country flying. And you had a great flight with Raphael.
Yes.
You want to participate?
Yes, he asked me, and I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, so we'll get a pretty good group. Okay, we'll probably have a meeting tomorrow night or so to talk about it.
Okay, let me know.
Yeah, okay. Well, sending out emails. Okay, thank you, and my apologies. Okay, so this the previous. Yeah, don't go past the wall here, right? So these are where these lines become really steep. That's the wall. Don't try to get past the wall. So the previous graph looked at, you have a thermal and you think you can get a better one with a deviation. This is you're flying along, and you deviate to get into better air, meaning air that is in a netto context, the air that is rising a bit, maybe not so much that you can climb, but it will stretch your glide. And this can be quite significant. So this is for a glider. We assume it has an LOD of 40, right? So you're flying along, The air is neither rising nor sinking with an L over D of 40. And then this here is the air mass, the netto lift. That means what the air does around you, right? So it's half a knot, 1 knot, 1.5 knots, 2 knots. And this is what your L over D does if you fly in rising air. With half a knot, you go from 40 to 53. 1 knot, you go to 80. And actually at 2 knots, you're at unlimited because you're not sinking anymore. So this is when your L over D will become infinitesimal. And then it becomes negative, which means you're going up. Okay, so back down to our 40. And then it depends on how fast you're flying. And again, in weak conditions, if you're flying with a McCready setting of 1 knot, you're flying pretty slow, right? Then you can actually, in order to get into under a cloud street or so, where you expect maybe half a knot air mass lift, you can deviate about 35 to 34 degrees. It still makes sense, right? If you're flying fast, let's say with a McCready setting of 5 knots, which is really fast, if you sort of aim for half a knot up in the air mass, you can only deviate about a little over 20 degrees. So again, the stronger the conditions, the less deviations work. So this is not just in finding thermals to climb in, but also with air mass, with the air mass rising. For example, in convergence lines, we quite often have, well, this is really the essence of a convergence line is there's 2 air masses coming together and they're going up. And what we see there is, we see maybe sort of often sort of 1 knot, maybe 1.5 knots. And then there's thermals embedded, of course, we can use to climb. But what we use these convergence lines basically to build our L over D gets much better, right? Sometimes you get to the 2 knots or so, and you can see this later when you analyze your flight. And so with this basically gives you some guidance on how far to deviate to get under a cloud street, or to get into a convergence line, or maybe there's a ridge line or whatever. If you follow sort of, or if you're already in a line of lift and you follow that, then you say, well, but it doesn't take me where I really need to go. The question is, how far off are you, right? And anywhere 10, 20 degrees, you're fine. Follow that line of lift, right? If it's more, then at some point you gotta say, I gotta go and head back towards my turn point. Okay. So brings us, we talked about McCready a lot, and I think everybody has sort of a bit of a basic knowledge what it is. And we also want to talk about the classic speed to fly model. So the McCready setting, or Paul McCready, smart man, found out that if you fly fast, if you're expecting a strong thermal on the other side of let's say a dead area or a sink area, so you're leaving a thermal and you're expecting a strong thermal to get, then it makes sense to fly faster. And he quantified this with this McCready ring. So this is a variometer. It's the most simple form of a McCready setting. Most computers have a knob that says MC on it. And as you turn up the knob, you turn up the McCready setting. It's the same as with this ring. It's just fancier. So if the ring is set to 0, then the speed it'll give you, see there's speeds down here, right? There's probably can't read this. There's 100. This is kilometers an hour. 120, 140. And of course, the airplane has a sink. So the variometer as you fly will sort of point somewhere here. And then you can fly the speed that it shows you here. If you drop into some sinking air mass, then again, it makes sense to fly fast in a sinking air mass to get through this quicker. And then it's the McCready will point down to maybe 120, 100, 130, 140, right? This is meters here. 3 meters, it points at 140. And this is for an ASW 28, I think. Yeah, that's what it says. This is a standard class airplane, 50-meter airplane. Standard class, not 50 meter. So now this, you can turn this ring and you can say, well, I don't want to fly best LOBD. I want to fly faster. And you can put it, let's say, to 1 meter or 2 knots, or you can put it to 3 knots. And that means that all these speeds, they move up. So you start flying a higher speed if you always fly the speed the little needle points to. And I should also say, of course, the needle dances around. There's no need to sort of go like this all the time and dance and try to follow the needle. Just get sort of the rough idea where the needle points to and then fly that speed. Okay. So the question is, of course, in the MacReady model, the limitations it has, it assumes you have unlimited height and you never hit the ground, in other words. So with unlimited height, you also have unlimited range. So there's nothing that tells the MacReady model, well, you can't fly that far, that fast, because you will hit the ground. So the real life is a little different. And the other thing is, here I'm writing thermal average. It's just the classic MacReady model says you set your MacReady value or ring to the expected lift in the next thermal. Well, what is the expected lift? There's 3 kinds of lift, and I come on here. So there is the first kind is the vario indication. That's what your indicator says. Here it says 5 meters, 10 knots. And here, this is an electronic vario, 5 meters, 10 knots. Nice, but this is not the lift you have. Then there is a circle average that averages your lift over the over one circle, about 20-30 seconds. That's why we call it also the 20-second average. And that's already, many gliders have a circle averager that's already quite a bit lower. And then there's the thermal average. The thermal average is basically how long did it take you from when you started turning to until you leave the thermal to climb whatever, 1,000 feet or whatever you climbed. So this is then the average climb you had over the entire thermal, taking into account time to center and also leaving the thermal and so on. And that's the thermal average, and that's really what is required for your MacReady. That's what you're referencing when you set your MacReady, right? Not the what you see on the vario, not what you see on the circle average, basically what the thermal average is. And from experience, I can tell you quite often we're flying on a really good day and we see the vario needle go up to 6, 7, 8 knots sometimes. The averager is maybe at sometimes at 5 knots, right? 5.5 knots. And then we analyze the flight after on the ground through CU, and we check the average, the thermal averages, and then we see 3.5 knots or something like this. So don't be surprised how much lower the thermal average is versus what you see actually on your vario, right? And so if you look at this guy here, here's the needle. That's at 5 meters. The 20-second average is showing 4.2 meters, so it's nice. It's 8.4 knots. That's this little Dewey here. And then this is the thermal average, is 3 meters or 6 knots. So even a 10-knot thermal, in the end, it's only a 6-knot thermal average. B, and then in the window down here, it shows you the netto. That basically shows you what the MAS is doing, how the MAS is climbing. Okay, so you're climbing almost as fast as the MAS, so it's pretty good. So again, to sum it up, the important thing is the thermal average if you set your McCready. And so this is the classic Reichmann-McCready model explaining things, right? So where it comes to decisions. The McCready model always assumes it is a glide climb model. So it tells you basically how fast to glide based on how fast you expect to, and I say expect to climb, because once you're here, you don't know how fast you will be climbing here. It's an expectation, and so it's a guess. And so you make your decisions, right? So there is you have the 4 cases. There's case number 1. He says, okay, and what we see here is we are at 4,500 feet, and at about 37 kilometers away is a 6-knot thermal, big cloud, good-looking cloud, 6-knot thermal. And in between are some smaller clouds where we expect to have about 2 knots, pretty weak. So here's the guy, and he says, I'm pretty conservative and don't want to give up a lot of height. So I climb under this cloud, I climb under and I set my McCready to 2 knots, which is this here. What the lift I'm expecting under these clouds. So I climb here, then I climb here, and after 25 minutes, I mean, he's nice and high, but he is still about how far behind? Something like 13. As he's here at 24 kilometers. So he's still 13.2 kilometers from his goal, right? So he's not, well, he's a little further now. Okay, so he's maybe 10 kilometers still short of that cloud, but he has good height. Okay, so number 2 guy is he has heard my speed talk and he says, gotta go fast. And this is a 6-knot thermal. Well, let's say he went to the McCready school. There's a 6-knot thermal. That's what I'm going to do is I set my ring to 6 knots on my computer, and then he goes, and he goes. And after, this is 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. After 14 minutes, he's actually where the big cloud is, but he's on the ground. Because with this McCready 6-knot setting, McCready doesn't know about the ground, but there is a ground, and he basically didn't arrive high enough to climb out. Okay, so not good. So you have to make more decisions, right? And then you have the guy, then you have a guy who says, I don't like this McCready thing. I fly, as a matter of principle, I only fly best LOD. All this McCready hocus pocus is no good. With best LOD, I'm safe. So he flies on, and flies on and on and on and on, and then he actually gets to the cloud, also not very high, only 300 meters. So in practical circumstances, I would question, this is already pretty low, right? It's already taking, no, actually he's arriving here. Sorry, no, he's flying on the black line. He's arriving here, and after 25 minutes, he's just about to get into the thermal at 420 meters. Nah, that's okay. And then we have a guy who says, yeah, I know about McCready, and I know I should not fly McCready 0 because it's slow. I fly McCready 2 because it's really far to this cloud. And so he flies along there. So he flies a little steeper than this guy because he has a higher McCready, but he's also quite a bit faster. He joins this cloud at 300, or the thermal at 310 meters, 1,000 feet, which is something else we need to talk about. And then he gets it and he climbs up, and after 25 minutes, look where he is, he's at cloud base. Now, we have to also talk about reality. Number one is, if you leave a thermal and head for a cloud, a big cloud that is 37 kilometers away, and it takes you 18 minutes or so to get there, there's a pretty good chance this cloud won't be there anymore, or may have died. Has probably happened to all of you, and has happened to me often, that I was heading for a cloud, and by the time it took forever to get there, by the time I was there, the cloud was dying, right? And the other thing is, of course, trying to get the thermal that low at 1,000 feet is pretty risky as well if he doesn't get it, or if the cloud is not being fed from the ground anymore. He may be under the thermal and just doesn't get it anymore. So this is a pretty risky thing. But for the purposes of illustrating the model, it basically says even with a moderate McCready setting of only 2 knots, you're quite a bit faster, and then you can make it up the lost time, of course, by climbing. If you set it too high, you have to take into account how far you can get, and if you set it too high, then you hit the ground. And this is I've seen this in contests where people said, well, I was really going fast, and if I wouldn't have laid it out, I would have won the day, right? Okay, what I would have done is just for practical purposes, I would have flown like the red guy, number 4, but I would have pulled up here on the first cloud. So I would have had a better climb. I would have pulled up here, improving my climb, and here I would have assessed. Here I would have been still 10 kilometers or 12 kilometers away from the big cloud. I would have looked at the distance, and I would have said, this is I'm getting awfully low here. Either I see the cloud dying, then I would have just climbed up here. Or I see, well, the cloud is still really strong, but I don't want to risk it to get that low before I find a thermal. So I would have climbed a little bit here. It's a weak thermal, but with a little extra height, I could have then gotten into the cloud at a height where I would expect to either get it for sure, or if there's nothing, if the cloud has died, I'm high enough to find another thermal, right? I'm not dead in the water. That's what I would have done. So basically make another decision in this particular case before you set out and bridge another large area of just gliding. Okay. By the way, there's a great animated explanation of polars and McCready settings and so on this link, and I'll show the link at the end as well. You don't have to copy it down now. Okay, so what other things play in there? We said we've talked about the risk a couple times now, right? When I said, well, you're risking that you may not get it, or you're risking a land out. And as I said before, I'm talking about risk in the terms that you may get stuck low and lose a lot of time, or you have to land out, right? So we can turn this around. We can call it the luck factor. Actually, Ingo Renner, 4 times world champion, he said to me once, he had a good flight, right? And he said to me, I was lucky. And then he said, the more I practiced, the luckier I got. And that's exactly it. It's not really luck in the lottery sense. It is really managing the statistical odds. There's another great Cochrane paper out for this. And so basically, if you fly along and your chance to find strong lift will improve the further you fly, obviously, right? So assuming your chance to hit a 4-knot thermal within 1 kilometer is 5% on a given day. If you fly 10 kilometers, then your chance is 52%. If you fly 20 kilometers, then your chance is 77%. So the takeaway here is that having more range improves your chances of finding good thermals. You'll never go to 100%, but and past the 77%, it doesn't. The curve really flattens out. You don't really need to get. But having a 77 or 75% chance of finding good thermal is pretty good, right? So sometimes it makes sense to trade speed for range. So in other words, I go slower in order to get more range. And that's exactly what our guy did, who slowed down, who didn't set it to 6 knots in the previous graph. He says, well, I'm trading some speed off for more range, right? That's exactly what he did. And so when you're low, you have to be conservative, because that if you're low, it also means you have low range. So there you want to be pretty slow, right? And if you want to sort of read up John Cochrane's paper here, it's called McCready theory with uncertain lift and limited altitude. So he's putting basically the limitations in, first of all, that you can't glide forever. There's a ground. And secondly, you don't really know for sure how far, what the lift in the next thermal will be. You're guessing, right? Okay. What is also known is, it comes out of that study too, that higher performance gliders, they're tolerating higher McCready settings simply because they glide a lot flatter, and they have more range already built in. So with a low performance glider, let's say a PW5, you got to be happy that you make it to the next thermal. And if the thermals are too far apart, you won't. With an modern 18 meter glider, you usually have the option of 3-4 thermals in a row, where so you go to the first one, it doesn't work, you go to the next one, and you still, after the third one, you're still high enough that you can climb. So that means you can also fly faster, of course. You can take higher risks because you have more built-in range. Well, that's what it looks like. So trading speed and range. If you fly best LOD, let's say this is the best LOD line, the blue one there. You have the best range, but you're also pretty slow. So when you crank the McCready up, then you're on a steeper path, and you're losing after a while. You're lower. This is the loss of height you have, and you're losing the range, right? Quite a bit of range. So these are the trade-offs. You're faster, but you're losing. You will arrive lower, which can also be a problem if there's a ground, right? Or if you're already low, and you may not make it to the next thermal. That's the other thing. So if we take this now into the real world and look at my glider, ASG 29 18 meters, or modern 18 meter glider, wonderful glider, by the way. So and I compare several McCready settings to best LOD. So best LOD we already saw is pretty slow. And so now we try different ones. So if I set my McCready to 1 knot, then I'm trading about 6% range. So I'm losing 6% range, but I'm gaining over 17% in speed. So that's a pretty good trade, right? I'm not losing much range, and I'm gaining quite a bit of speed. If I set it to 2 knots, I'm losing 15% range. It's quite a bit. It's 3 times as much almost, but it's still not a problem, right? And I'm gaining 30% of speed. And now I'm saying, well, what if I set it to 6 knots, right? Yeah, then I'm losing almost half my range, right? I'm losing 46% of my range. So this is almost half. And I'm gaining 80% in speed, which means I'm not really doubling my speed, but I'm still gaining quite a bit of speed. But if you look at the relationships further up, the range loss is small compared to the speed gain. Down here, not so much anymore. And with the McCready settings, there's also a wall. And so at about 5 knots and higher, your range loss becomes pretty significant, and your speed increase, it's still there, right? But it doesn't go up like this anymore. So here comes the magic of water now. If I say, well, if I fly my speed ring, my McCready at 6 knots, if I set it at 6 knots, I should have water because it's a strong day, and then it looks a lot better, right? It looks now my range loss is only a little over 40%, not 46 anymore, and my speed nearly doubles. So the trade-off gets a little better. So basically, you should be thinking of your McCready setting as your gas pedal. The McCready model has many shortcomings. The classic McCready model, as we talked about, no ground and all these things, and it doesn't take distance into account and so on. But that doesn't mean that we throw it out. We have to be aware of the shortcomings. And what the McCready setting really is you're trading speed for range. So that's like the gas pedal in your car. If you're driving really fast, you'll have to stop to gas up much earlier, right? When you're short of energy, when you get low or things look dicey ahead or so, then you want to sort of go easy on the gas pedal and stretch your glide. If it looks like booming all the way, cloud streets in every direction, or in the direction you're flying, then you may as well put the gas down a little more and crank up the McCready a little more. Often people ask me, well, what McCready were you flying? And there's no answer to this because I was changing my McCready setting as per requirement. It depended where I was in my working band. Was I at the bottom? Was I at the top? How did it look ahead? And all these things. That's called shifting gears. So we are not flying with one McCready setting for the day. That's for sure. So we basically move it around. So out of Reichmann in his book had a really good graph of where he sort of puts the losses together, and also remember it's an assumption when you set your McCready ring to the next thermal. You're assuming this thermal has a certain value, right? It's an assumption. And of course, it's unlikely that you set it to 6 knots and you'll hit a 6 knotter. You may set it to 6 knots and you hit a 5 knotter or whatever, right? It will be very likely something different than you expect. So this graph here shows the McCready setting in knots, so 0 to 5. And as I said, more than 5, it becomes, depends where you fly. If you fly in Utah and Nevada, yes, I mean, when you hit 10 knots all the time, you may as well crank your McCready up to 7 or whatever. If you fly in Ontario, 5 is already pretty high. Okay, so this is your McCready setting. This is the actual thermal you find. And keep in mind, it's the thermal average, not what your needle shows, right? It's the thermal average from when you start thermaling until you roll out. Okay, so what happens? If you set your McCready 0, so you're the conservative guy, and obviously you're expecting more than 0 for flying, otherwise you won't fly cross country, right? You don't fly cross country if there's no lift. And so you hit a 2 knotter, which is really not a great thermal, right? But right away, if you climb in this 2 knotter, you lost, compared to setting it to 2, you lost 10%. That's a pretty significant loss. And that's because you were so slow with the McCready setting 0 with best LOD. 0 is best LOD. If you hit a 4 knotter, you have lost 20%, right? If you hit a 6 knotter, you lost even 30%. So this is why we are saying unless you're really in trouble and you're in survival mode, avoid setting McCready to best LOD because it is just too slow. If you set your McCready to 2, which is not very aggressive, if you have to take a 1 knotter, let's say it's really weak, yeah, you lost 3%. If you fly into a 2 knotter, obviously no losses because that's what you expected with your McCready 2. If you hit a 4 knotter, you think, man, I was way too conservative. Now there's a 4 knot thermal. Well, not really, because your loss is only 2.5%. So it is really negligible. It's not much. So even with you can even fly into a 4 knotter or if there's 4 knot thermals around, you're not doing all that badly with a McCready setting of 2. If it gets stronger, of course, you fly it to a 6 knotter. But again, keep in mind, this is thermal average. And I don't think I have seen a 6 knot thermal average in Ontario in the last couple of years. Maybe 2 years ago, we had a really good year. But anyways, then the losses, this is when the losses really start going up. At McCready 3, this almost moves a little further into the fast. But if you have to take a 2 knotter, very little loss, right? A 3 knotter, of course, 0 loss, because this is what it's set to. 4 knots, 0.5% loss, no problem. And even a 6 knotter, if you hit a 6 knotter with a McCready 3 setting, your loss is minimal compared to somebody who would fly with a McCready of 6 and hit the 6 knotter. Okay, and then there's the 4. For strong days, there even 6 knotters only give you a 1.5% loss. And if you have to take a really weak thermal, you set it to 4, and you have to take a 2 knotter, 4% is not so bad either. So the blue highlight here in this table here highlights an area of, it's the sweet spot of McCready settings. And the sweet spot is 234. That's why I call it the 234 rule. And on the side here, this is done for an ASW19. You also see what is the loss of range. 2 knots, 11%, 3 knots, 20%, 4 knots, 26%, and 5 knots, it's going down pretty quick, right? You're losing basically over a third of your LOD. So the ASW19 is a max LOD of about 36 or so. So a third of that would be 12 points, right? So you're going down to 24 if you fly that fast. Okay. Then there's something else. Or any questions to this? I heard somebody move.
Yes, Will said in the chat, does using water give any advantage at lower settings?
It does if you're heavier, but the other thing is if you're setting it lower, that also means that the expected lift you're expecting to find is lower, and water is, this is where you take the penalty. Water makes it harder to climb. So if there's anything out there less than 4 knots, don't take water, because you're losing more than you're gaining. And I'll get to water a little later. Water is also, of course, a consideration. Okay. So, but before we get there, the advantage of deep climbs. What do I mean with a deep climb is if you climb, let's say, 2,000 feet in one thermal or so versus 500 feet. So let's assume we have a circle average of 5 knots, which is 500 feet per minute. And time to center this is taking 2 minutes. So if we now take a 1,000-foot climb, the thermal average for this climb, because it takes us 2 minutes to center, 2 minutes to climb, is 4 minutes. 1,000 feet divided by 4 minutes makes the thermal average only 2.5 knots. So it's not a 5 knot thermal, even if the circle average is 5 knots, it's a 2.5 knot thermal average. However, if you now the same thermal, circle average 5 knots, and you're climbing in the thermal 2,000 feet. Then you have, it takes you 4 minutes to climb up there, right? This is 500 feet per minute, right? The 5 knots takes you 4 minutes to climb up there, 2 minutes to center, takes you a total of 6 minutes to get from when you start turning until you're up at the thermal. So the thermal average now, for the same strength thermal, it's 5 knots, is now improved to 3.3, because you're basically minimizing the overhead, which is the center time. The 2-minute center time is now less prevalent than if your climb time is only 2 minutes. So it's a question of minimizing the overhead. What it basically means, if you have a good climb and you can climb high in this good climb, it stays good, take it, right? Or conversely, don't do 300-foot climbs. Sometimes people, they sort of hang close on cloud base and they fly a little bit, and oops, there's another thermal, and they do a few circuits to climb another 300 feet, and they keep on going. Hello, did you say something, Emerson? No. So basically, don't take many little climbs if you can take a few deep climbs. Now in Southwestern Ontario, where we usually don't have a very deep working band, it's difficult to take 2,000-foot climbs. We need to have a pretty deep working band for that, because this would mean that we start pretty low to the ground to start climbing. And but still, you can have a lot of 1,000-foot climbs in your working band, and so. But avoid the 500, 300, and 500-foot climbs, which I see often, which are not necessary, right? And this brings me now to the whole issue of working band, very important. And so what is our working band? Our working band is where we basically want to fly with our gliders. So that's a height band, right? What is the top of the working band? Is this blue line here. It is the cloud base minus 500 feet. Remember, we have in controlled airspace, we have to stay 500 feet below cloud base. And so this is the top of our working band. And the bottom of our working band is either half of the distance from the top to the bottom to the ground. This be the ground here, or 2,500 feet above ground AGL, whichever is more. So basically, let's say our cloud base, or the top is 4,000 feet. So let's say cloud base 4,500 feet. Ground is in our area is about 1,000 feet. So we have 3,000 feet to play with between ground and the top. So if we now just take half, that means this line is at 1,500 feet AGL. And that's not high enough. Your risk, if you fly all the way down here, your risk of not finding another thermal in time at 1,500 feet is pretty high. So you don't want to get that low. That's why I'm saying half or 25, but not less than 2,500 feet. Let's call it this way. So you should always, the bottom of your working band should not be lower than 2,500 feet AGL. Okay, but for example, on a day where the blue line is at, let's say, 7,000 feet, we have those two, right? And ground is 1,000, so you have 6,000 feet to play with. Half of it is 3,000, so you can make this here 3,000 feet thick, and then yeah, you can have nice steep climbs already, right? And the other 3,000 is a nice buffer to the ground, and you should still be able, if you stay above this, to connect with clouds and so. Because there's also one problem is if the clouds are up here and you're down here, at some point you can't really connect the thermal to the cloud anymore, or there is no more thermal because the thermal has already, the thermal source has expired, the cloud's still there and air is still going up, but not down here anymore. And I've seen this often that I joined the thermal and there were gliders only a few hundred feet above me. And at my level, there was no more lift because the hot air reservoir was exhausted. So it was all in the end was going up, and I didn't connect. I was below the air that was going up. All I found was burbles from the air that was going in. So if you are sort of in the top half, if the clouds are up here, if you're in the top half there, then you can look up to the clouds and you can use the cloud also to find the thermal and center it. If you're getting really low to the ground, it's much better if you look down and find thermal sources down at the ground, because the clouds probably won't help you anymore unless you see other gliders that are equally low and they're thermaling, and you can connect this to a cloud, then it still works. But if you're on your own, when you're really low, look down, not up, because the clouds, there's no point in going somewhere because there's a big cloud. There's a good chance the cloud would not work at your level. Okay, so now we have our working band here. And now what we do, so yeah, and the other thing I should say, if you're at 1500 AGL, then you should go into survival mode. And survival mode means then you turn your MacCready to best L/D, because you need all the range you can get to find to still find thermal. There's no point in then still going fast at this level. You're already out of the race. You're in the race when you're up here, right? You're surviving down here. So set your MacCready to best L/D, gives you the best range, and then go from thermal source to thermal source, gravel pits, towns, fields with tractors in it, and you name it, right? And see what you can find, right? Until you have something. And even if it's a weak one, climb in a weak one, try to get at least back in your working band, get some range, and then you can still go and find a better thermal. But you have to get away from the ground. If you're still in racing mode down here, and I've seen people who were, you're going to land out. And it requires patience. The beauty about gliding or soaring is competitive soaring. You have to be efficient, you have to be fast, but sometimes you also have to be very patient, where it doesn't matter anymore what the others are doing and how fast the others are. In order to stay in the race, you have to stay airborne. That's the important thing. And no matter how much time it takes. Once your glider touches the ground, you're out of the race. Okay. And how fast you were up to that point doesn't matter. You only get distance points. Okay, so now in our working band here, we divide this again. And in the top half, we can set the MacCready setting pretty aggressive. This is when we want to go fast and we have lots of air underneath us. Again, depends on how big the working band is in the first place. And there we only take the strongest lift. So we fly along and we fly into a thermal. Obviously we pull up in the thermal, but we are not turning, right? Unless we have been flying in, let's say, 4 knots, and this is a 10 knotter, then we make an exception. But otherwise, we'll fly to the bottom of the top half of our working band here, unless you get a super duper whatever thermal. And once you get through here, try to find a thermal. Once you get into the bottom half, then you want to be a little careful. So maybe dial the MacCready back a little bit. If you had it set at 4 knots up here, dial it back to 3. And there you also, if your thermal presents itself, don't be overly picky anymore. Like if the day gives you 4 knotters or 5 knotters, and this is only a 3 knotter, maybe take it. Depends where you are. I mean, if you're still up here, I would still go for a 4 knotter. But if you're sort of getting to the bottom of this band, maybe a 3 knotter will do it, and work yourself up. You don't have to take it all the way up to the top, but take it up until you have reasonable range again, and then we go. And yeah, that's basically what you do. And so on a go back to a 7,000-foot model. Oh no, we can look at something at reality is better. Okay, so reality. So this is a flight I did last year. I think it was my best flight last year. I hope it's coming through for you. Not sure if I can make it any bigger. No, it is what it is. Okay, so started in Rockton, went up north, and then it went sort of down west of London area, and then back home. I think this was already back home. So we see On the working band wise, initially the peaks are at 7,000, right? This is 7,000 here, and then later in the north, because the ground's higher, quite often when the ground is higher, then the thermals go higher as well. So north is north of Arthur, they're up to Mount Forest, Durham, and so on, Flesherton. So it's going up to 7,500, right? So so up here, if we sort of say, okay, the top here is 7,500, the ground it's also is 1,000. So then we have 6,500 to play with. Of course, up here in the north, the ground's a little higher. Ground is more like 1,600. Yeah, so let's say we have 6,000 feet to play with. It's easy, it's better, right? And then we 6,000 feet of air in here. So then we take half of it, the top half. So we go from the top down to from 7,500. We go 3,000 feet down, half of 6,000. So we're at 4,500, which is this line here, right? Okay, I'll put a line. Okay, my line is a little. Yeah, my line is a little below 4,500, but that's okay. So this is close to 45. So that would be now our working band is here. That's our working band. If you look at the flight, yeah, initially it touched out, got a little lower, but this was also an area where the tops were lower. Okay, and then as the tops got higher, the flight there's a whoops, went a little below, but not much. Otherwise, all along, this doesn't count because this was when I was back at SOSA. So what we do is, so I wasn't really flying cross country anymore. I was doing a low safe at SOSA. We do a final glide on the field, and then we try to climb our way again on a thermal, just to practice low safes as well. So if you look at these climbs, they're typically first of all, there's no 500-foot climbs, right? There's a teeny wincy climb here, but I'm pretty sure this wasn't a climb. This was where I found lift going straight, and I gained 500 feet. So I don't think I circled in this. So deep thermals is, for example, one of those, right? It goes from 3,500 to 7,500. That's a nice deep climb, right? Or this is a nice deep climb. This is a nice steep climb. There's a few smaller climbs. This one, I think this was a climb. So that's from 6,000 to 75, 1,500-foot climb. It's okay, but that was a day where you could actually have 2,000-foot climbs easily, or even 3,000-foot climbs, or 2,500-foot climbs, because the working band was pretty wide. And the bigger your working band, the nicer and better and faster you can fly. If you fly in the western US, Utah, Nevada, thermals go up to 20,000 feet, but airspace ends at 18,000, so you cannot fly higher than 18,000. Actually, you can't even touch 18,000. So that's your top of the working band is 18,000, and the ground is typically, I mean, there's mountains there, but the valleys are 5,000 to 6,000. Let's say 6,000, right? So you have a 12,000 foot. You have 12,000 feet to play with. Take half of it. You have a 6,000 foot working band. So with a 6,000 foot working band, you can actually fly straight. You can make 60 kilometers or more, or 70 kilometers easily, right? Without from one thermal to another, you can cover that in your working band. So your working band basically goes from 18,000 down to 12,000, and that's pretty much what it is. In those areas, you don't want to be below 10. If you're below 10, if you're getting to 10, you're low. Then it becomes difficult to find thermals, to connect them with the clouds, and so. But boy, oh boy, is it ever nice to fly up in that working band and have such a wide working band. I mean, A 6,000-foot working band is nice, right? There's no question about it. And we get the same in places like Namibia, and so even a little bigger because the ground's a little lower and the ceiling is a little higher. So we get another 2,000 feet in the working band, which is, of course, the bonus. Okay. So as I said before, we have this is the, we don't want to be below this, and then this is our blue line that gives us the aggressive part of the flight, where the upper part of our working band where we really go, right? And we try to sort of climb if need be up again, but not really. We don't want to find any climbs up in between here. We really want to find them at the bottom of the upper part of the working band. This is where the McCready setting is high, where we go fast, and all the good things. Okay. Then you also have to change gears. So you always have to take a look out what's happening around you. This is pretty extreme, right? You're flying from beautiful weather, and there's also beautiful clouds, and so right under major overdevelopment with major rain and whatever, right? But you got to see what's happening. You could have a different air mass. Happens in Ontario quite often, in southern Ontario, that is blowing in from a lake, and all of a sudden everything is getting blue. The clouds become really raggedy. So that's something you have to watch. And the other thing is, of course, what do you do? So when you feel, and in what direction is it bad? If you're heading into it because there's your turn point or so, then it's time to bring your McCready back and become more conservative. Okay, so if we sum this all up, first of all, you need to know the limitations of the model you apply. If you apply the McCready model, you have to know there's no ground, right? And stuff like that. Your precise McCready setting is not really important, and following it precisely, following the speed precisely is also not important. If your McCready setting is on the conservative side, you have better chances of finding better lift or lift at all. Reduce your McCready setting as you get lower, but avoid setting it to 0 unless you're in survival mode. And let's say if you have a McCready setting of 4 and you're in your working band and you get into a 3-knot thermal, you should not thermal in the 3-knot thermal. You should either find a better thermal. If everything looks hunky-dory, you're wasting your time, so find a better thermal. Or if things get dicey, then you have to change gears and set your McCready setting down. But as soon as you say 3 knots is, you have a 4-knot setting and 3 knots is acceptable to climb, and you're in your working band, so there's no immediate need to climb, then you should reduce your McCready setting to 3 knots as well. And then you want to maximize your thermal average, which means you have to center quickly, keep the overheads down, and deeper climbs will actually help you more, will help you bring the thermal average up. But like in everything, there's no hard and fast rules, and everything depends on the circumstances. This is just sort of a guide, and yeah, depends on the circumstances. Okay, we'll take a quick okay. I'm just wondering if we should take a quick water in, water out break, or if we're good to go. Let's take a 5-minute break and then we keep on going. How is that? So we'll start again at 2:30. Okay, see you back at 2:30.
Will we stop the recording for the break?
Unpause the. Wonderful, thank you. I got it. Okay, I'll take a quick look on all the chats. Yeah, McCready 0 is best LOD. Okay, somebody was asking if cruising fast, how do you tell it's a 3-knotter? Some computers have actually a netto function in the vario, so they show you what the air is doing outside as you're cruising. That's how you can tell. The other thing is, how does it feel, right? Or you go in and you pull up, you turn, you do a turn, and if you see, well, this is really a weak thermal, right? Then you keep on going, right? I mean, you wasted a turn, but it's still, if you need it, it's fine, right? But you can quite often see simply on your netto what's happening outside, what the air outside is doing. Okay, and then yeah, I mean, obviously in lift, when you get into lift, you fly slower. Your McCready will direct you to fly slower, your speed director. And when you get into sync, you fly faster. But it's not good to sort of overdo the purposing because or the purposing because it's not very energy efficient if you sort of pull up and push down too hard. Okay, so well, the next thing brings us to the question of water. Okay, so why is this not working? Yes. Question of water. What does water do? It certainly increases the speed in the glide, simply because you're it's like putting lead on a sled, right? You have more energy. So if you bring a big load of water, like 100 kilos up to 7,000 feet, it represents quite a bit of energy up there. But it costs you to bring it up there. And then it helps you, of course, it drives you faster. It gives you better LOD at higher speeds, but it increases the minimum sink. So when you climb in weak thermals or fly in weak thermals, your minimum sink, which is normally sort of maybe a little less than a knot, all of a sudden is maybe a knot 1.3, 1.4 knots. And of course, that makes it worse when you then turn, right? You're not flying straight anymore. You turn, and it's a little more difficult to climb with all this water on board. And because it makes you fly faster, it brings up your stall speed and everything, and also your thermaling speed. You have an increased turn radius in the thermal. And there it's much more difficult then to get into the core, simply because you're flying. Remember when I said your turn radius increases with the speed square. So let's say if your airplane is empty, you can thermal at 45 knots or so. But with water, now you have to thermal at maybe 53, 54 knots. That increases your turn radius. There's no two things about it. And if the thermals are very narrow, it makes it very difficult to climb. I remember years and years ago, Dave and I were flying after the Nationals in Clairsholm. We went to Invermere and we flew in the mountains there. And the thermals in the mountains are very tight, very strong, but very tight. And because they were so strong, the first couple of days we flew with quite a bit of water. But more and more as the week progressed, we had less and less water on board because we found it just difficult with a lot of water to climb in these really tight thermals. And so it's a trade-off between more speed on the run and but weaker climbs. So it doesn't matter if the climb is, let's say, 6, 7, 8 knots. If you lose a knot in the climb, it doesn't matter, right? So you go from 6 to 5. But if the climb is 2 knots and you lose a knot, you lose 50%. If you're climbing with water with 1 knot instead of 2. So again, it hurts you in weak climbs. Doesn't hurt you so much in strong climbs because it takes a fixed percentage off the climb, right? No, it takes a fixed amount off the climb, maybe a knot or so, right? Or maybe half a knot to a knot, I would say. And if the climb is strong, it doesn't matter so much. But if it's a weak climb, it can take 50% of your climb rate away, and that's something you can't really afford, right? You will never make up with speed. Okay, so to take a look at what water is doing with the polars. So the red polar is without water, it's empty. The blue is with water. Well, first of all, the best L over D, which is really this line that is a tangent on the polars, does not change. There's so perceptions that the best L over D changes with water on board or so. It's not true. Basically, what happens is that the polar slides down along the line of best L over D to the water polar. However, if you fly best L over D, you'll be flying a little faster, not all that much faster, but a bit. But where it really starts counting is if you fly faster. Let's say you fly this point or this point on your polar, the P2, right? And now you go, and this line again represents a certain L over D as you're flying this point. And now you say I have water on, then with the same L over D, you're getting on the red polar, you're getting to this point. So you're flying quite a bit way faster if you project this up to the speed at the same L over D. And this gets more pronounced the faster you fly, basically at higher speed settings again. So in strong weather, water really helps on the speed. In weak weather, not really, right? And yeah, so that's the effect of ballast on the performance when you look at it, when you look at the polars on the performance of your airplane. So when does water make sense? In strong conditions. We should have more than 3 to 4 knots in the thermal average, right? So quite often in Ontario, we are sort of on the verge. Does it work or doesn't it work? So the other thing is smooth lift is good, because if it's really choppy, you will find it hard. The water will make the whole airplane more sluggish. Also, the roll rate is not so easy because you have all this mass out in the wings, right? So smooth lift helps. Choppy lift, not so good. And then, of course, wide cores are nice, right? And of course, the really good thing is if you don't have to circle it all, if you have linear lift, then there's basically no regrets for water. Linear lift means you don't have to circle, or you can climb or maintain altitude going straight. So typically when you fly a ridge, like down in Pennsylvania, these ridges are 800 kilometers long or so. Wonderful, right? You can just barrel along the ridge, and the heavier you are, the better, as long as you don't have to climb. Sometimes you have to climb a little to get over the gaps. It also makes the smooth a lot rider, smooth. Sorry, it makes the ride a lot smoother because the airplane has more mass. So if you get hit by gusts, they don't come through. They don't accelerate the airplane so much, so you don't get hit so hard. You don't hit the canopy all the time. Then in wave you don't have to circle either, but you got to be careful. I mean, freezing is a problem, and particularly the tail. If you have water in the tail, you should never be above the freezing level, because and it's not. I mean, the main water tanks will not freeze when you have 100 liters or so on board, but the valves can freeze, right? And then you may not be able to open them when you want to land and stuff like this. Then when you fly cloud streets, if you see cloud streets in every direction, hey, water is good, right? And also on convergence lines. So everywhere where you can fly more or less straight and you don't need to circle a lot, water is really good. And this is then what it looks like when you come back. We have all seen Luke coming back, right? In the old days, we used to finish like that, not anymore. And then what you have to do is you have to, before you land, of course, you have to get rid of the water. You should never land with water. The landing gear is not designed to absorb the force of water when the glider is ballasted. And you have to make sure that both tanks are empty. If you have one tank that empties slower than the other, in the air, it's not a big problem if and you hardly feel it, right? But when you land, your wing goes down, the fuller wing goes down, and bang, you have a huge ground loop. So you make sure that sometimes you can see where the water comes out of the wings. Make sure it has stopped flowing on both wings, not just on one. Okay, so typically common mistakes we see with water is that water is kept too long. Because the speed advantage is quite obvious. So you're flying 100 knots instead of 80 knots between thermals. And the climb penalty is not so obvious, right? You don't know, is this just a bad thermal that I can't really climb in, or what is it, right? Is it the water? You think it's a bad thermal, right? And the other thing is, if you drop your water, you can't get it back. When it's out, it's out. It was also a lot of work to load up, depending on what kind of airplane you have. And what you need to do is, however, you need to drop it as soon as you have difficulties climbing. There's no point in running around with water when you find you can't really climb. You lose so much. The other airplanes are climbing up higher and they are running. And yes, you're running fast with your water, but there is a ground, right? And sooner or later you'll be on the ground. So if you have difficulties climbing, drop your water or reduce it. You can also dump partial, right? If you measure how long it takes, just to take, let's say, put buckets under your plane on the ground and measure how long it takes to get 20 liters out, right? Usually it's in the it's roughly around 1 second per liter. So then you can do timed dumps. You can, if you have 100 liters of water on board, you can say, yeah, today 100 liters is too much. I dumped 20 liters. That works well. Unfortunately, with partial dumps, the tail tank goes completely because it's the fastest to dump. So you lose your tail tank, but you can lighten yourself up. And then if you get into trouble, you dump another 20 liters, and until you're empty, right? So rather than going from 100 liters to 0 in one go, right? But sometimes you have to do that too. The other mistake is that water is only used in contests. So people are using water only in contests. The water changes the handling characteristics of the glider, and it just flies differently. And if you need to be used to how your glider flies with water in order to compete with water. So if you want to use water in contests, you should practice with water. You should have it on board when you do your practice flights and this kind of stuff. Okay. Wind. What does wind do? Well, we all know it breaks up the thermals, right? This is not so nice. We're also drifting quite a bit. And particularly when we go into a headwind, when we are thermaling, we're drifting back, right? And it can actually, because of the back drift, it can take 35% to half away from your effective climb rate. So you're climbing the thermal, you're drifting back, and then you roll out of the thermal. And first of all, you cover the same ground you have already covered. By the time you're where you started with the thermal, you're obviously already lower than when you rolled out. That's why it says your effective climb rate, even though you may have 5 knots, you may see 5 knots on your vario, can be as much as half only, right? So therefore, we should really, if we fly a task and it has upwind legs and downwind legs and so, we should climb as much as possible on downwind legs. Because on downwind legs, you're drifting with the wind, so you're making headway while you're climbing. It's much nicer. And then on turn points, if you have a turn point where it's an upwind turn point, you're flying into the wind to the turn point, and then the next leg is you're coming out of the turn point pretty much the same way. You should, or it makes sense to sort of get fairly low into the turn point and do your climbing then on the next leg rather than in the upwind leg. And what you want to avoid, of course, the question is, well, how low do you want to go, right? But what you can do with many computers, you can do a final glide on the turn point and say, okay, I want to arrive at the turn point at 2,000 feet above ground or so. And then instead of climbing on the way to the turn point, you fly in, turn around, and then you climb out on the way out. And there, with the same rate of climb, it's a huge difference in the effective rate of climb you got with the wind, right? Because now you're making, while you're climbing, also headway on your task. If the turn point is such that it's upwind, you fly in, but the outbound leg is crosswind or so, then it's still makes sense to get a little lower into the turn point, but it's not as significant as if the outbound leg is downwind, right? And then one beauty is, and you see this in my weather reports when I say, well, it'll be quite windy. The wind will break up the thermals, but the wind also winds make cloud streets, and that's nice. So if you look at the sky like this, cloud streets are just wonderful, right? You can just barrel along under the cloud streets, and this is where you can fly linear lift. You don't have to the thermal, water works, and all these things. So here's another real life cloud street, right? Wonderful. That's really good. And you can also, when you fly a contest with an area task, an area task is a task where your turn areas are fairly allow you to choose where exactly you want to turn. And so if we look, I think this was an area task from the Pan Americans we had. So here is Sosa. The largest circle is the start circle. So here we have start. This was the first leg, right? And this is the first turn area. And then the task goes up into the next turn area, fairly large turn areas. It goes over next turn area. So the red circles are the turn areas, and then it goes back home. This blue, for the people who don't know, this blue circle here is actually the our self-imposed height limit in the corridor where we don't go higher than 5,500 feet, because otherwise you get run over by airliners. Okay, so with the wind, so let's say the wind is straight from the west and it's streeting the cloud streets. It makes sense to fly the first leg into the wind and take advantage of cloud streets that may be there. Of course, if there's no cloud streets, there's no point, right? But let's say there's a nice cloud street, so you can just follow that cloud street into the turn area, and instead of turning here or so, you turn down there. And then you go into the next turn area, and you go to a position where then you can again maybe fly exactly with the wind and line up with the cloud streets. That would be sort of here, like this. And from there, you go home. So by flying something like this and taking cloud streets into account, you can, in an AAT, you can really get an advantage. I saw that 2 years ago at the seniors. There were great cloud streets down in Florida, and lining them up with the various legs was really good. And the AAT allows you to do this. If you have another task where you actually have to go to a certain point, then you can't really do that. So what do cloud streets look like? So this is a typical southwestern Ontario day with a northwesterly flow. So flow is like this. And there's a massive cloud here, so that's probably not so good for gliding anyways. But then where it gets bluer and bluer. Here it's blue, likely because there's lake effect spilling over from Lake Huron right down to Lake Erie. So if you fly into this area, you're likely in trouble. You need to know that. But here in between, there's really nice cloud streets that are nicely lined up with the wind. That's why I'm showing you this, to see, how they line up with the wind. Okay. So last point, we are coming to the end of our flight, and this is the final glide. And a well-executed final glide can significantly improve your task speed. Ideally, you want to sort of slide into your final, dovetail your final from your en route mode into the final glide. That would be great. MacCready plays a role in the final glide too, and is basically the classic MacCready model, which is first a glide and then a climb, right? And you have to guess on how good the climb will be. It's the inversion of it. It's inverted. So this is on final glide, the climb is first and the glide then follows. And the nice thing about this is when the climb is first and you're in it, you know how strong it is, so you don't have to guess on the MacCready. So there's your going up, and if you have a good climb, you look at your final glide computer, and at some point it says, yes, you can reach home. And then you have to make a decision how high, provided the thermal keeps on going, how high you really want to climb. Ideally, you want to fly the MacCready setting of your last thermal, provided it gets you home. That's sort of theoretically the ideal case. The other thing is, normally we associate a high MacCready setting with aggressive flying in terms of taking more risks, and again, land out risks. On the final glide, a higher MacCready setting actually improves your safety margin, because you have a steeper final glide home. So when things go wrong and you fly through a big area sink or so, you can just slow down. You can back off the gas pedal, right? You have that opportunity. If you're flying a final glide with 0 MacCready setting, not only is it pretty slow, but you also have nothing you can back off anymore. So that's actually a pretty risky final glide. If you don't make it, if you get some sink or so, if you're far enough away, so you have then to stop climbing again. If you're close to the field, then it's really bad. Okay, so the inputs for the final glide are, of course, the distance, how far you're away, the wind component, head and tailwind component, and the MacCready setting. That's the speed. And you should never really trust your final glide computer. You should always check it against the rule of thumb. We say 1,000 feet per 10 kilometers, which translates into an LOBD of about 33. So for the higher performance planes, it is actually, it leaves you a little bit of safety margin. But for example, if you use it with juniors or so, or ASK 21s, so you're getting pretty close. So to that, so then there's not much safety margin in there. The safety margins you should build into your final glide is you should have an arrival height of 1,000 feet AGL plus 500 feet safety. So you want to arrive at 1,000 feet so you can fly a proper circuit. And the 500 feet are there where if you hit any sink or so on the way, sometimes there's this persistent sink on final glides, right? I had one, a real bad one last year. I'll tell you about it later. And again, avoid MacCready 0, because then you cannot slow down anymore. You're already slow. And you have basically, you can't back off the gas pedal anymore. So if it doesn't work out, you have to land out, or you have to find a thermal to climb. I had an interesting experience at the 87 Nationals in Chipman, Alberta. a long time ago. I was flying with a bunch of gliders. We have 5 or 6 gliders. We were flying along McCready 0 on a marginal final glide, hoping we'll make it. And I was a little behind them, and all of a sudden I feel my right wing is sort of wants to go up. And I made a decision. I mean, this is not an easy decision on a marginal final glide to start turning, because you can really lose it. You can lose the little margin you have. Anyways, I decided to turn, and sure enough, I turn, and there is the vario goes beep, 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 very welcome sound. And I had sort of a 2-knot climb there. And while, of course, none of the others had noticed this, so they were going, and the others were moving away from me. Well, I was stopped, and I was starting to climb there. And I was thinking, as I saw them moving away, I really wonder if this McCready thing is right. If McCready is right, I should be able to catch up with them again, right? And I climbed a bit. I climbed until my final glide calculator said, now you can go on final glide with a McCready rating of 2, McCready setting of 2. So I rolled out and kept on going, and sure enough, after a while, I not only caught up with the rest of them, I was higher, and I passed them and finished ahead of them. So it works. Okay. Yeah, don't do 0. So this is a model. I don't want to spend time explaining it. Nowadays, most people have digital, like computer final glide calculators. This is sort of how it used to work in the old times. You get here the height, the altitude, here the distance, and this basically is the combination of McCready settings in these lines here, in the horizontal lines, and wind. This is the 0 wind line here, and this is the headwind line, headwind area, and this is the tailwind area. And with that, you basically set your final glide calculator, and then this top line over top of it, that's your safety margin. That's really the final glide you want to run down on. But don't want to spend time explaining exactly how this works, because there's others that are sort of, they have the size of a dinner plate where there's a map in there, so you can do the same thing. Okay, let's look at 2 scenarios, because the reality again is a little different. First scenario at 4:30 p.m., so we're getting later into the afternoon. On a good day, lift ranging between 3 to 6 knots, you're 60 kilometers out at 6,000 AGL, climbing in 5 knots. Your final glide computer says you need another 1,000 feet to be on final glide with a McCready setting of 5. Remember, the rule said we set the McCready to the thermal, the strength of the last thermal we're having, and provided it gets us home, right? Otherwise, we're not on the final glide. Okay, so the question is, do you stay or go, right? So this is the one, and then we have another scenario. On a really weak day, you're 7 kilometers out, you're scratching around at 600 feet in 1 knot, but you're high enough to make it home with best LOVD. For a setting of 2 knots, you would need another 100 feet. How high do you climb? So we deal with this later. We deal with the first one first. Okay, so the first scenario. First of all, over a distance of 60 kilometers, there's a good chance of making up the missing 1,000 feet by either pulling up in thermals or finding a 6-knotter. Remember, your thermal is only 5 knots, so finding a 6-knotter there. So that tells us the further out the final glide is, the more options you have, which is nice, right? So, and then of course, if it hasn't happened at 3,000 feet, you can still slow down or find a climb or whatever. Excuse me. And I think my voice is about to give out. Okay. So, and then of course, one of the things, a lot also depends on what lies ahead. If you see this picture on your way, hey, lots of lift ahead, can't be bad, right? If you see something like this on your way, better be careful, better be have some extra reserves packed there, because don't expect too much lift anymore on this. Or if you see this ahead, rain and stuff, you better have an even bigger safety cushion, because there could be huge sink on the way. So basically, look at the situation. What's ahead? This is nice. That's what you want to have. But this is sometimes what you get. Okay, so let's say we climb. Decide we climb up to 7,000 feet on McCready 5. So the time, we add another 2 minutes climbing there with 500 feet a minute, right? The distance is 60 kilometers. The speed, I took my glider as an example, the speed at McCready 5 is 95 knots or 176 kilometers per hour. Or I could also leave at 6,000 feet as I am, and it would give me a final glide. It's what my glide computer says, with McCready's 3.8. And that gives me a speed of 161 kilometers an hour on final glide, but I'm saving myself the 2 minutes. Okay, I could also leave at 6,000, and I do this with the grader of my McCready, my final glide speed, or if I don't have final glide yet, if it says you can't make it home, then I just keep along with my en route McCready setting, which could have been 3.5 knots or something like that, and then I bump it up to McCready 5 over the last 30 Ks. I can do that too. Okay, so the case 1, time to finish would be, so we have a 2-minute climb time. We have 60 kilometers to go at 176 kilometers an hour. Takes us 22.46 minutes to get home. Case 2, this here, we're leaving at 6,000. So we don't have the 2-minute climb time. 60 kilometers, this speed, pretty much actually it shows, even so the McCready theory says that this would be the better thing. It shows a slightly shorter time. What it really does is it says it doesn't make much of a difference. Again, remember when I said to you, when you get into the higher McCready settings, it doesn't make all that much of a difference in the speed anymore. That's what it is. Makes a big difference if you set, if you start out with McCready 0 or 2, but it doesn't make a big difference anymore if you start with McCready 4, which is 3.8 basically, and 5. And that's basically what's expressed here. Same time, so it's not something to agonize over much. Then of course, but if you're starting out, this is safe because you can make it home with this 3.8. You have final glide. You start out and you say, well, I will try to bump it up, as we call it. So you fly into lift under clouds, and so we pull up at thermals, and I'll bump it up to the McCready 5 in the first half of my glide. So we're starting out 30 kilometers, we fly at a slower speed with the McCready 3.8. And then we have bumped it up. So now we can put it up to 5. And so now we are here at 21.4 minutes. So clearly faster. So this is basically, if your look ahead looks good, remember the picture with all the clouds? If it looks like that, then you have a good chance that this will work. Or if you're really optimistic, you can also simply say, I'm starting out, you know what? I'm leaving at 6,000, but I'm starting out with McCready 5. You can do that too. So basically, and how long, and then I trust that somewhere along the way, I can bump myself up to the final glide for McCready 5, right? Basically, gain the missing 1,000 feet on my way through pulling up in thermals, which in 60 kilometers is reasonable. Then what you get is we have basically this case here without the 2 minutes, because you're not waiting, you're not climbing up, but you're starting out with McCready 5. So you're doing the speed, 176K, you're doing 60 kilometers, And so you can take 2 minutes off this time because the 2 minutes don't exist. So you're doing 20 minutes and 20.4 minutes. So you're still another minute faster than this guy. And that's a bit aggressive because you're starting up pretty fast. But I mean, making up 1,000 feet on a long final glide is certainly, if there's queues around, certainly possible. Of course, if the air looks totally dead ahead and there's cirrus and whatever, we had in the Pan Americans, we had a final glide. The last thermal was north of Arthur, quite a bit. And then it was go best LOVD and hope for the best, right? There was no more, this was the day with the thunderstorms and so there was no more thermal. And that was a different story. But if it looks good, and I mean at 4:30, remember this all happens at 4:30 in the afternoon, you still have a good chance to find good thermals. It's that the day is not over yet. If it would be 7 o'clock, then I would say if you have a good thermal, this is probably the last of the day. Better go up as high as possible and make it home on that thermal. Don't try to fly below final glide and bump up. But if it's good, then this is the fastest way. Just set out with McCready 5 and bump it up. So you eventually you're not on the final glide yet, but you can bump it up to final glide. Okay, so this brings us back now to our previous scenario where you're really close in and you can make it in, but only with remember you're at 600 feet and you are climbing in 1 knot. And you have to climb another 100 feet to have McCready 2. So what do you do? Well, first of all, this is a very, very dangerous situation because you are, yes, you're really close to your field, close to home, but at 600 feet AGL, you are already below circuit height. And if you now set off with McCready 0 to make it home, if anything goes wrong, you find a little bit of sink somewhere, you will not make it and you will hit a tree and it will be bad, 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 bad. So obviously, and then there's really no chance on such a short distance to find, and so low, to find usable lift. Don't bank on finding lift. If you're 60 kilometers out, you have all sorts of chances to find lift, but not at 7 kilometers. Remember, the chance to find lift, it goes, the further you go, the further the distance, the better your chance. So once you start your final glide, then you're totally committed. And that's why we call this situation here that you're in the coffin corner. Once you start your final glide, if anything goes wrong, there's no alternatives anymore. So basically what you need to do is you need to stay in that thermal if it goes up and go up, not just to, so you can do a final glide with 2 knots, climb up to 1,000 feet or whatever. So you get yourself some cushion, you get yourself more air under you. So there, the final glide, speed is not the issue here, safety is the issue. And the higher you get, the more safety you have. Ideally, you should really be arriving at 1,000 feet, right? That would be perfect. but even if that's not possible, if you arrive at 500 feet, this is a lot better than arriving at 0, right? At AGL. So this is, I picked this scenario because it is a dangerous scenario, and I want you to remember the term coffin corner, and I want you to recognize, first of all, I want you to never be in the coffin corner. I've seen terrible accidents this way, and recognize when this is unfolding, right? So yes, that's what it is. Okay, and that brings us to questions. And by the way, this the game with the polar down there, it's sort of a live animation. It's really good. This is the URL for it. Okay, any questions? Okay, we still have 50 51 people on the call. In the slideshow.
Hey, Jorg, it's Stephen. I've got a question.
Yes.
Some glide computers, some glide computer programs, including XC-SOAR and others, have the ability to select automatic McCready. How does that exactly work, and how often does it refresh? In other words, does it keep changing the McCready if you set it on automatic McCready?
I don't know how often it refreshes. It obviously goes by the experience it has from your previous flight. It cannot look ahead. So I would never use that, right? I always basically do my McCready setting manually myself. And I vary it, right? I turn it up and turn it down, depending on how things are going. So I would caution people to use the automatic McCready setting. And if they do, they should monitor really they should always know what McCready setting they're flying. That's really important. And as I said, it can only go by the average lift you have had in the past, on your past flight, but it is not a prediction of what will happen ahead of you, right? If the day is pretty uniform, and then it's okay. So if you had 5-6 knots, I mean, this is how we personally do it too, right? We go by our experience in the past. But you can easily miss the opportunity to change gears by setting it that way. You have to be on your toes and change gears if necessary. Anybody else?
Hi, Jorg. I have a question about, you were talking about the deviation and how many degrees you're deviating from a course.
Yes.
Do the glide computers actually show you a deviation in degrees? Is there an option for that, or do you just have to sort of guess?
Yeah, no, they show you that. Typically, a glide computer, I mean, every glide computer is a little different. My old glide computer would show me a bearing to my turn point, right? So many degrees to get to this turn point. And it would also show me a ground track, what I'm flying actually. And and the difference between the two is actually my angle of deviation. My present computer shows me a line to the turn point I should be flying, and it shows me another line, different color, pointing where my nose is pointing, basically, or my ground track is pointing. So I can look at it and see, okay, this is getting pretty bad. Okay, sorry about that. Yes, so most computers show that. If you don't have a computer, then then you have to eyeball it, basically. Okay, another question. I should say for the next Hangar Talks, which will be our 2-seat learning experience panel discussion, we'll be on the old regular login again we have been using for the previous Hangar Talks. This one I thought perhaps we get over the 100, and I didn't want to cut it off, but I think we only had about Oliver took track of it, and
I have a question, Jorg.
yeah.
It's Tyler of Edmonton. You mentioned earlier in the conversation about your cruising, and you have to decide whether it's a 3-knotter or a 4-knotter or a 2-knotter. If you're cruising at, a cross-country speed, how do you determine that? Because when you're flying at your slower thermaling speed, you're going to get a different climb rate. So how do you kind of figure that one out?
Yeah, somebody touched at this earlier. How do you know what the climb when you're cruising? How do you know what the climb rate will be, or what the many computers for example, the LX computers, when they're in cruise mode, they show a netto vario. And netto means it shows what the air outside is doing, outside your glider is doing, if you're going up or if you're going down. So if you're flying along, and of course you're going down because you're flying fast, but on the netto vario, it can show that the outside air is going up at 3, 4, 5 knots, right? You gotta take into account that the variometers have a bit of a lag, right? It's not like in it's not like in Condor where they have no lag. So what you feel is, first of all, your speed indicator. You're flying along, let's say at 90 knots, right? And you hit the thermal. Your speed indicator will go up and will prompt you to slow down pretty quickly, right? The needle will go all the way up. And so that's already a prompting to slow down. And then you look at perhaps at the netto and see what it says. If it says 6 knots, it's pretty good. And you can also judge by that's something that we don't get from the simulator, is the acceleration when you fly into a thermal, right? Basically, you feel this in your seat cushion, right? And if that feels good, if this is a really strong acceleration, you know you have hit something strong, then I would turn in. It can still be a false alarm that sometimes happens, depending on how badly I need the thermal. But if it's really good, I'll turn in and do maybe a circle. If the first circle, let's say I turn in to the right because I think the thermal is on the right. If that doesn't give me anything, then I'll overfly my input track or my incoming track and try the other side. And if that doesn't work, then I'm gone. It doesn't work all the time, but quite often, if you feel a really good surge in the acceleration, it's there. And then you just after the first turn or the first 2 turns, we should know from your circle average roughly what it is.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome.
Jörg, I have a related question. I know what netto is, and I know what relative netto is, and most people talk about using netto, but to me, relative netto seems like a more useful thing to display when you cruise and would help when you hit that thermal to know whether to turn or not. So can you tell us about your own experience? Do you like to use relative netto or netto for display?
Actually, I don't know what relative netto is.
So most flight computers have an option to netto is just what the air is doing. Relative netto adjusts for the normal sink rate of your particular glider. So if it shows positive, that means you will climb. If it shows 0, the climb is just enough to match. You'll just maintain height. You won't actually gain. So it adjusts for the polar or the minimum sink speed, of the glider automatically. So you don't have to do the math. You say, oh, I just hit netto 6, but my sink rate is 2, therefore I'll net 4. It does the calculation.
Oh, it
just
does
shows
the calculation.
4. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if I can take 2 knots off the netto myself. Well, if it's available, I've never come across that, right? Yeah, it may be pretty good. I'm going more really by the feel of the acceleration than the instruments, because the instruments are behind the things typically. And so you really, if you want to turn into the core, you want to really have the big push, the surge, right? And then you turn in. So I go much more by that than looking at instruments in these cases. But I mean, if the relative netto is good and reliable, yeah, it's a good thing to use.
Yeah, just so that everyone understands, relative netto is often called super netto as well. That's the terminology they often use.
Yeah. So my LX 9000 doesn't have that. Gotta complain to Dave. Okay, but it's yeah. I mean, it gives you valuable information. It's still questionable in the end how fast it will climb. in a thermal, because it depends a little bit on how the thermal is distributed and if there's a good core and all these things. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so I'll stop the recording. Okay.